want Jesus to walk with me. Guide my feet, Lord, and walk with me. Walk with me. Guide my feet, Lord, and walk with me. All along this tedious journey, I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me. Walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me. All along this old tedious journey, I want Jesus to walk with me.
What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arm. What a blessedness, what a peace of mind, leaning on the everlasting arm. Oh, we are leaning, we are leaning. I am safe and secure from all alone. We are leaning, yes, we are leaning. Yes, I'm leaning on the everlasting arm. Oh, what have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arm. Oh, I have blessed peace with my Lord so near, leaning on the everlasting arm. Church said we are leaning, yes, we are leaning. I am safe and secure from all alone. We are leaning, yes, we are leaning. I am leaning on the everlasting arm. Say, guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. Oh, guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. Oh, guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. 'Cause I don't want to run this race in vain. Well, now hold my hand, Lord, while I run this race. Oh, hold my hand, Lord, while I run this race. Oh, hold my hand, Lord, while I run this race. 'Cause I don't want to run this race in vain. Oh, speak to me, Jesus, while I run this race. Oh, speak to me, God, while I run this race. Oh, speak to me, oh, while I run this race. 'Cause I don't want to run this race in vain. Say, I hear freedom while I run this race. Oh, I hear freedom while I run this race. Oh, I hear freedom while I run this race. And I don't want to run this race in vain.
Thank you. Thank you. Can the church say amen? Let the church say amen again. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so delighted to see each and every one of you here for a very special plenary session we have this afternoon. As you can see, a very distinguished panel of speakers for you. I want to take this opportunity to introduce myself and to thank all of you again for coming out this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Karen Jackson Weaver, and I am the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Diversity at Princeton's Graduate School and the series editor of the Teaching Religious Studies series in partnership with AAR and Oxford University Press. This afternoon, our panel, The State of the Black Freedom Struggle, it's a special session dedicated to exploring and discovering new aspects related to the civil rights movement then and now. We are fortunate to have a wonderful group of speakers for you this afternoon. I will start first with the Honorable Julian Bond and tell you a little bit about Professor Bond's work in the movement, from his college days as a founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, otherwise known as SNCC, to his chairmanship of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Julian Bond has been an active participant in the movements for civil rights, economic justice, and peace, and an aggressive spokesman for the disinherited. As an activist who has faced jail for his convictions, as a veteran of more than 20 years of service in the Georgia General Assembly, as a writer, teacher, and lecturer, Professor Bond has been on the cutting edge of social change since he was a college student leading sit-in demonstrations in Atlanta in 1960. Professor Bond was born in Nashville, Tennessee in January 1940. His father, the late Horace Mann Bond, was the first president of Fort Valley State College in Fort Valley, Georgia. In 1945, Dr. Bond became the first black president of the country's oldest black private college, Pennsylvania's Lincoln University, and the Bond family lived at Lincoln until 1957, when Dr. Bond became dean of the School of Education at Atlanta University. While a student at Morehouse College, Professor Bond was very active in the movement. He was one of several hundred students from across the South who helped to form SNCC on Easter week in 1960, and shortly thereafter became SNCC's communications director, heading the organization's printing and publicity departments, editing the SNCC newsletter, The Student Voice, and working in voter registration drives in rural Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. I could go on and on. He has a very long CV of very impressive accomplishments, and I want to just continue briefly to say a few other things. Professor Bond returned to Morehouse he left actually Morehouse just short of graduation in 1961 to join the staff of a new protest newspaper, the Atlanta Inquirer. Many of you, I'm sure, remember that. He later became the paper's managing editor. He returned to Morehouse and graduated, and you will be glad to know that upon his graduation, he was elected in 1965 to a one-year term in the Georgia House of Representatives in a special election following the court-ordered reapportionment of the legislature. But members of the House voted not to seat him because of his outspoken opposition to the war in Vietnam. Bond won a second election to fill his vacancy in 1966, and again, the Georgia House voted to bar him from membership. He won a third election, this time for a two-year term, in November 1966, and in December, the United States Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the Georgia House had violated Bond's rights in refusing him his seat. He was elected in 1974 to the state Senate. When he left office in January of 1987, Bond had been elected to public office more times than any other black Georgian living or dead. Professor Bond holds honorary degrees from over 20 universities and colleges. He has been the host and commentator on America's Black Forum, the oldest black-owned show in television syndication since 1980. Currently, Professor Bond is a distinguished scholar in residence at the American University in Washington, D.C., and a professor at the University of Virginia in the Department of History. Please join me in welcoming Professor Julian Bond. To his right, we are fortunate to have Atlanta's own Mayor Shirley Franklin. Mayor Franklin was elected the first woman mayor of a major southern city in 2002 and served 2 terms until 2009. The mayoral term in Atlanta is limited, as you all know. During her 8 years, the city experienced unprecedented population growth and afforded Franklin the opportunity to partner and collaborate with many local and regional leaders in addressing urban policy challenges, which included urban planning, economic development and infrastructure, and so many other aspects. Aside from her role as a public official, her community service spans over 35 years in Atlanta and includes her active participation in the arts, homelessness, and higher education. Mayor Franklin currently holds the position of the William and Camille Cosby Professorship at Spelman College here in Atlanta. She also serves as the co-chair of the Regional Commission on Homelessness and as the co-chair of the Center of Civil and Human Rights, in addition to serving on the board of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. Professor Franklin completed her undergraduate work from Howard University and her graduate work from the University of Pennsylvania. And in 2009, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights completed the purchase of the exhibition rights for the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. collection. These are the King papers with an $11.5 million payment. And I wanted to share this with the audience to make sure you know this, and we appropriately salute Mayor Franklin for her vital role. The papers, which are owned and archived by Morehouse College through the Woodruff Library, will be exhibited at the center when it opens here in Atlanta. This achievement is the culmination of 3 years of efforts led by Mayor Shirley Franklin. So will you please join me in thanking and saluting Mayor Shirley Franklin. And last but certainly not least, we are pleased this afternoon to feature Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock. Reverend Warnock has served as the senior pastor of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, the spiritual home of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Having responded to the call to ministry at a very early age, Dr. Warnock became at age 35 the fifth and the youngest person ever called to the senior pastorate of this congregation founded in 1886. Yet before coming to Ebenezer, America's Freedom Church, he was blessed to train and serve within the pastoral ranks of leading congregations, also known for their deep spiritual roots and strong public witness. He began as an intern at the 6th Avenue Baptist Church of Birmingham, Alabama, a leading light during Dr. King's Birmingham campaign. From there, he served for 6 years as the youth pastor and 4 years as the assistant pastor of the historic Abyssinian Baptist Church of New York City, also one of the nation's leading congregations, led by the likes of Reverend Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Reverend Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor, and now Reverend Dr. Calvin Butts. Before taking the helm of Ebenezer, Pastor Warnock immersed himself further in the challenges of urban ministry in the 21st century while serving for 4.5 years as the senior pastor of Baltimore's Douglas Memorial Community Church, also a spiritual base of social activism. Reverend Warnock graduated from Morehouse cum laude in 1991, receiving his bachelor's degree in psychology. He holds a Master of Divinity degree from Union Theological Seminary. Seeing his pastoral work as tied to the ministry of scholarship and the life of the mind, Reverend Warnock continued his graduate studies at Union, receiving a Master of Philosophy degree and a Doctorate of Philosophy degree in the field of systematic theology. As a pastor, Reverend Warnock sees the whole community as his parish. Accordingly, he has defended voting rights in his own state of Georgia. Dr. Warnock is a graduate of the Leadership Program sponsored by the Greater Baltimore Committee and a graduate of the Summer Leadership Institute of Harvard University. He has preached his message of salvation and liberation in such places as the National Cathedral, the Riverside Church of New York, and the International Festival of Homiletics, a global gathering of preachers to hear excellence in preaching and in college and university chapels across the country. Through it all, Dr. Warnock is seeking to be faithful to his calling through an abiding commitment to Christian ministry, disciplined scholarship, and diligent struggle on behalf of the oppressed. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Raphael Warnock. And before I take my seat, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our distinguished presider this afternoon, and that is none other than Dr. Johnny B. Hill, the president of the Foundation for Reconciliation and Dialogue. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hill. I'm out of breath.
Friends, once again, can we give a round of applause for our panel? Isn't this a terrific panel that's been assembled this afternoon? For the sake of time, because we know that many of you have questions you'd like to ask of the panel, and we do have a reception right next door immediately following the session. Let's just get right into the questions, if we would. How things will proceed is we're going to ask our panel a series of questions, and then we're going to open up the floor for conversation and dialogue. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the student sit-in movement, when students began sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina on February 1st, 1960. It soon spread all across the South. As many of you know, Ella Baker, who was then the executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, borrowed $800 from SCLC's budget to organize a meeting on the campus of Shaw University on April 15th, 1960. There, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was born, that led to a wave of protests that crushed the very foundations of Jim Crow segregation in the South. Reflecting on this historical moment, and of course the civil rights movement in general, I'd like to ask the panel, if we could just reflect for just a moment, in what ways do you think progress has been made since that time? And what do you think are the challenges to advancing the black freedom struggle, even as we think about the fall term election just days away?
Well, you know, I can't help but think about your question. Think about the 50th anniversary celebration of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was held in Raleigh this summer. We expected 300 people to come. 1,200 came. And I have to tell you, I've been to my college reunions, I've been to my high school reunions. I've never been to an occasion as joyous, as happy, as filled with reminiscence and memories of old times than this. It really, in many ways, a highlight of my life. And I'm 70 years old, as you now know, since she was kind enough to tell you my birthday. So it was just great to see these people with whom I had labored in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee 50 years ago. Some of them I never knew well. Some of them I didn't know at all because they worked in different parts of the South than I did. But just see these people who had done so much, suffered so much, struggled so much, and to spend these 3 days with them was just a high point of my life. You'll be happy to know, especially the academics here, that we videotaped every moment. And we're getting ready to put the videotapes or the CDs, the DVDs on sale. They're not inexpensive. They're not too expensive. Your universities can afford them. And when you have this, you'll have a treasure of reminiscences and thoughts from people who made the civil rights movement. Not just people who've studied it, but people who made the civil rights movement. The one thing about the 60s and the sit-ins is the sit-ins represented a massive uprising of black young people. And that uprising has never since been repeated. It's never been equaled. It never has happened again. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that so? All of us deal with young people on the campuses where we speak. Why are they so out of it today when they seem to be so into it years ago? You know, I've always felt badly when I said to my own children, when I was your age, because my father said that to me and I didn't like it then, when I was your age. But when I was the age of these kids, you know, I was doing things. We were changing the country. And why they won't do it now or don't seem called upon to do it now is a mystery to me. But to answer the question, of course, we've made enormous progress since those days. I mean, just to look around us, we have a black woman is president of Xerox, I think. A black man's president of the country. And a black man is mayor of Philadelphia, Mississippi. And I bet none of us ever thought those things would happen, any of those things would happen. And I never thought a black person would be president of the United States in my lifetime. And I didn't think Barack Obama would be president until he won the Iowa caucus. And I said, well, if these white people will vote for him, then hey, maybe so. So, of course, we've made undeniable progress. From the 1960s to today, we've passed laws. There are laws now that protect us from this invidious discrimination that was so prominent then. But it's sobering to think that Rand Paul, the Republican candidate for Senate from Kentucky, now thinks that the Civil Rights Act, which allows me and many of you here to eat where you want to, sleep where you want to, go where you want to, he thinks it was wrongly decided. And one must believe that left up to him, it would be wiped off the books. And we'd be right back to where we start again. And you wonder, when you hear these people talk about taking our country back, where they want to take it back to. If Barack Obama is all that stands between them taking it back, then good for Barack Obama. Because they want to go back to a day when I couldn't eat at lunch counters, when I couldn't go to movie theaters, when I couldn't do many of the things I can do today. I wouldn't be a teacher at the University of Virginia. I wouldn't be able to go to the University of Virginia if these people had their way. So we have to be frightful of the notion that they want to take us back to this day. So we've made undeniable progress, great progress in these years, from 50 years from the beginning of the sit-ins until today. That doesn't mean that victory has been won. It doesn't mean that these efforts can stop. If anything, they need to be redoubled. I think we're going to talk later on about the frightening incarceration rate among black men, but that's just one example of how badly we need to continue on struggling and struggling and struggling, and can't assume that now that Obama's president that all of the evil has been wiped away. It's amazing to me how I run every now and then, not very often, thank heaven, run into people who say, gee, you got a black president, what do you want? Well, I hate to say what I want, it might be frightening to some people, but I want more than that. And I want the assurance this won't be an anomaly, that this won't be a one-time thing, that the possibility of this happening again and again and again will always be there. I'm not asking for black people to be president for the rest of the history of the United States, but I am asking for the likelihood of that happening be ever present. Until Obama made it possible, it wasn't ever present, and now he's peaked in he's lifted the shield, he's made it possible. So I think these are good times. That is, in the sense, comparing yesterday to today, these are relative good times, but comparing what ought to be with what is, these are bad times, and we need to work hard to make sure the bad times become better.
Well said.
Thank you.
I don't know. Yes. Well, there's no question in terms of electoral politics. I think my time as mayor, it became really clear that with all of the accomplishments, the issues of poverty still are pervasive in cities like this one, where we sit downtown in a hotel with wonderful conference, but the poverty level in the city of Atlanta is upwards of 24%, largely children and senior citizens. We gained 120,000 new residents in the last 8 years. Most of them who have come into the city have not been African American, and most of them have been higher educated, and they are coming because they want the convenience of living in the city, and they also want the lifestyle of living in the city. But the people who are poor are second, third, and fourth generation poor, and it's very, very hard to address those issues without looking at the issues of public education, access to higher education, training, retraining, and all of the obstacles that stand in the way. So the first time the city's population moved to about 23% below the poverty line was when Andy Young was in mayor in the 1980s, and it has stayed there regardless of all of the efforts that have taken place by a whole series of community leaders. So I think we have to rethink our approaches, and I for one think that we are not yet, at least in our community and in Georgia, perhaps not in other parts of the South, really paying enough attention to education. And there's lots and lots and lots of data that suggests that. I mean, we just celebrated, the governor of Georgia just celebrated what he said was an 80% high school graduation rate, except that those who evaluate such things say it's really 58%. So in a sense, it's not any better, because we're still making up the numbers, and we're still lying about the condition of people who, especially young people who, for the most part, are the victims, and they are, as opposed to being the actors, those who can change things. So, I mean, those are some of the things that come to mind. So even with a school board that is predominantly black, a mayor, I'm the 4th mayor, African-American mayor of the city, even with now four decades of what we would call progressive and enlightened leadership, the issues of poverty in our community prevail.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this invitation. Thank you for having me sit next to Shirley Franklin and Julian Bond, legends certainly in their own right. I'm grateful to be here. I think that clearly there has been progress since the Civil Rights Movement. Parenthetically, I was born after the Civil Rights Movement, but as I take a survey of history, clearly there's been a tremendous progress since that point. I would echo some of what we've already heard, that in the one sense, since Dr. King's death, there's been this burgeoning black middle class. There's no doubt about it in the decades after his death. And still, there is the permanence of race in America, what Derek Bell called the faces still at the bottom of the well. This permanent black underclass. And of course, it's not just black folk who are stuck at the bottom. There are a lot of poor white people and poor brown people, a lot of poor people in America. And part of what has changed in the last 20 years, it seems to me, in American electoral politics, Mayor, is that the poor have been so effectively maligned that for the last several election cycles, politicians running for national office, and in many cases statewide other offices, can't even say the word poor. Poor has dropped out of the American political lexicon. At the same time that you have these growing rates of poverty. I was quite frustrated with that even during the last election. We didn't hear from any of the politicians on both sides of the aisle much talk about poverty. It's the middle class and middle class and middle class. And many of the people we've lumped in as middle class really are not middle class. And the middle class are vulnerable because of the deplorable state of health care in this country, et cetera, et cetera. So part of what has happened tragically is that we have not managed, since Dr. King, to find the kind of moral language and movement to come to grips with America's unfinished business with poverty. I know we'll talk about the criminal justice system in a minute, but clearly it seems to me that that's the least impacted by the civil rights movement. In fact, it's gone in the other direction with 2 million Americans in prison. I think there are 9 million people in prison worldwide, 9 million worldwide, and there are 2 million in prison in the United States of America. Clearly, the society itself is sick. And so the question is, how do we speak to that? I agree with Michelle Alexander that this is something we've got to take on. I don't mean to go to your next question. But clearly we need a movement. We need an abolition movement around America's profit-driven, increasingly privatized prison industrial complex.
Well, just to pick up on that theme for just a moment, as many of you know, the last movement that King was sort of focused on was the Poor People's Campaign and Operation Breadbasket in 1967 and 1968, where he was sort of drawing these themes together: militarism, incarceration, and poverty. And I'm wondering, from your particular perspectives as a professor, someone who's involved in the political arena as well as in parish ministry, how do you see these connections? We're still involved in to some extent, two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. There's mounting incarceration. There's increasing poverty. Where do you see these points of connection in your work? And how do you think we should sort of how do we begin to name those beasts in our time?
Well, as unpopular as it seems to be today, the root of these is race. The root of these disparities is race. Let me read you some things. 1 out of 3 black men between 20 and 29 is under some kind of criminal justice supervision on any single day. If not in prison or jail, then on probation or parole. A black man born in 1991 has a 91% chance of going to jail sometime in his life. For his white counterpart, the chance is 4%. One result is 1.5 million black men could not vote in our last election. That's 13% of all black men in the country. It is estimated that 1 in 3 members of the next generation of black men will be disenfranchised at some point in his lifetime. No other democratic nation in the world denies as many this most basic right because of felony convictions. And of course, this doesn't happen by accident. In our oxymoronic criminal justice system, race, more than any other factor, determines who is arrested, who is tried, for what crime, who receives what length of sentence, and who receives the ultimate punishment. In the years following the Civil War, felon disenfranchisement laws targeted newly freed slaves, with many requiring the loss of voting rights, only for offenses thought to be disproportionately committed by blacks. In Mississippi, for example, you could be disenfranchised if you stole a chicken, but not if you killed the chicken's owner. Today it is the disproportionate and discriminatory enforcement of the war on drugs that has weakened the voting power of the black community. Voting barriers like black codes, literacy tests, and poll taxes may no longer exist, but other impediments have taken their place. Those of you who live in California and who go home by election day, make sure you vote to legalize marijuana, because it's surely this prohibition against marijuana as part of this draconian war on drugs that has created this enormous population of black men in prison. And it's black men in prison for crimes that white men commit every day, all day long, and are never targeted with the same fierceness that black men are. So race is the bottom of these things, and until we get past race, they're going to continue on.
I would just, I agree. It's worthy of, I mean, those statistics are stunning. And one of the biggest challenges is my time as mayor was the issue of how to address rise in crime, or the perception of crime, or the reporting of crime. As a matter of fact, for the last 2 years of my term, crime was going down, violent crime was going down. But regardless of where I went in the city, because the first 15 minutes of every local news report, unless there's a terrorist attack or some major flood, the first 10 to 15 minutes are about a crime. And that crime might be committed in the city, in a particular location, but it actually could be any place in America, and it gets reported as if it's occurring on the local news. The impact of that on the average everyday voter is that they believed, at least for that period of time, that anyone who was threatening in any way in how they looked and how they dressed and where they walked, therefore should be arrested. I have been in churches when I have been told by the pastor that if someone is standing on the street corner, I should have him arrested.
Not Ebenezer.
No, of course not. I say that because I spent 3 hours at this particular town hall meeting, basically defending that people had a right to be both smelly, ugly, mildly disruptive, loitering, lazy. They had a right to be all of that on a public street corner. And that therefore we should not sweep them up and put them in the criminal justice system. But I will tell you, it was a bear to tackle. And I suspect it's true in other communities as well. Mind you, crime was going in this direction. It had been high, it was at record levels low. But I couldn't find anybody in Atlanta for 2 years who would even read the numbers. They said it didn't matter. So this notion, it all works together. I mean, it's race and it's how it's portrayed in the news How it's portrayed in the news then terrifies people. And then no matter where they are, including in church, they gather their fears together and they just don't want to hear any alternatives. It was baffling to me. It was baffling to me. And I got labeled as being belligerent because I wouldn't give into it. Because I said, no, crime is down. Is it still too high? Yes, but it is down, and we should not start vigilantes. So, I mean, some of this is really tied to our institutions too. It's not just being done to us, some of it is we're doing it to ourselves. And regrettably, I mean, it's very, very hard for mayors to take this on. And it is not discussed in the political arena. As a matter of fact, the biggest issue in the last mayor's race was tackling crime. The violent crime rate was the lowest it had been in 40 years. But every candidate, black and white, bought television time to tackle crime. And if you say, well, that's not really the problem, you've got issues there, but it's certainly not the problem that it is being portrayed as. It is very hard to stand against that. I mean, that intention that anyone, I mean, look at the young men, you said 18, but look at the new laws on children and the weapon in school. I mean, in many cases, you don't have the school district no longer has a choice to make a judgment about whether a child is suspended from school if they bring so-called weapon, and that weapon could be a dull kitchen knife. So we've as a society adapted this notion that the way to be safe is to lock up everybody that we think might have made a mistake.
So in some ways you see embedded in the educational system is sort of this impulse to criminalize.
Absolutely.
Or cast.
Absolutely. It's embedded in the local politics. I can't speak about the national politics as much, but it's embedded in the local politics. I mean, I will speculate that crime in Atlanta is going up today. I will speculate that that is the case. But for 2 years when it was down, people acted like it was up. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It's almost as if facts don't matter. Data doesn't matter. And then if you can't have a discussion about the data and the research, whether it is that the incarceration of black men really much younger than 18. The only other thing I would say is I spent a lot of time with high school students when I was mayor. I met with about 7,000 one-on-one over a period of 5 years, helping them to fashion a post-secondary education. Among other things that surprised me, the most surprising thing was the percentage of high school seniors in Atlanta. The senior class is about 2,000 in any given year. The percentage of high school seniors who did not live anywhere particularly, who lived from place to place. And with a graduating class, this is the group that made it now. This is the group that beat the odds. This is the group that didn't drop out. I'd say it ranged from 25 to 30% a year that they had been sleeping on a sofa, just finding a place to sleep, but had the resolve to graduate from high school. That was stunning to me, that 17 and 18-year-olds have been just turned out on their own by the community and by their families. I'm amazed that as many of them made it as did, and most of them did graduate and then went on to do either in the military or workforce or to college. But 25 to 30% of a graduating class not having a place to call their home without supervising adults, I suspect Atlanta is not an exception.
Dr. Warnock, just what do you think about these sort of connections? Nelson Mandela once said that all politics is local. So what happens in local spaces like Sweet Auburn here in Atlanta is profoundly connected to national and international politics as well. In fact, it was at the pulpit of Ebenezer where Barack Obama gave his speech, The Great Need of the Hour, that sort of connected the black freedom struggle with the larger political realities of today. How do you see this sort of, these concerns, these local concerns, connected to some of the larger national and domestic issues, especially with groups like the Tea Party?
Well, related to the mayor's frustration that she is eloquently expressed, with crime rates going down, still the perception of crime related to that is that over the last couple of decades, prison construction has continued to rise unabated, regardless of crime statistics, and across Republican and Democratic administrations. Prison construction has continued. So we're really, we're talking about the extent to which we really ought to view the situation that our young people are in as we're dealing with political prisoners. If race is the issue, even though crime is that's the thing that's put out in front, what we're really talking about is political prisoners. And that somehow we need an abolitionist movement, it seems to me, to address this system of incarceration in the United States of America. I have felt this close to me. Folks in Atlanta, know I was involved very closely working with a young man by the name of Gennaro Wilson, and I'll say something about that in just a second. And now I'm very involved with trying to save Troy Davis from the death penalty. But just this past weekend, this hit very close to home for me. I have a niece who is a student at Georgia State University. Excellent student, never been in any trouble. Well, she called me yesterday morning, and I said, what's going wrong? She told me she was downtown at the detention center. She was driving from a friend's house late Friday night, about midnight, ran into a police roadblock. They asked her for her license. She didn't sweat it. She wasn't worried about it because she had a license, insurance, all of that. She presented that. The police officer said, do you know your license is suspended? She said, no. And this happened yesterday. We're still trying to figure out what happened. Her insurance is current. She doesn't have any current speeding tickets, never a DUI or anything like that. But according to the record, her license has been suspended. We're still trying to figure that out. But around the issue of race and perception and how people are handled from the moment they're encountered by law enforcement, this is a great example that, it frustrates me. It's my niece. And so everybody knows, or more of our young people need to know, that in the state of Georgia, if your driver's license is suspended, they can arrest you right on the spot. She presents her college ID. She's clearly confused. She doesn't understand what's going on. As far as she knows, her license is current. The police officer agrees that her insurance is current. Because he pulls it up, he takes her to jail. She's a 22-year-old student in college. And so he had some discretion at that point. And, but it was still important to him to take a young woman to jail on a Friday night. And she spent all of Friday night until Saturday morning when she finally could call me to go, and I had to go and bond her out, which was his own process. So this issue of race and who gets arrested, is a complicated thing. And I don't know what it takes, because I didn't live through that era. I don't know, I have the same question that Brother Bond has. I don't know what it takes to get us angry enough. You know, to get a movement started. And let me say, and part of it is, black folk are caught up in this web of perception too. We're afraid of our own young people. And somehow we've got to get our minds around this, because the young men that I've tried to defend, Janarlo Wilson, who, by the way, now is a student at Morehouse College, after having been sentenced to 10 years here in the state of Georgia. And we had to go through all of this, and folks who could have stood up for him didn't, and then finally he was freed and he's in college. Troy Davis on death row. What I want to say is that very often, if we're serious about this, we're going to be defending young people who are not Rosa Parks.
Yes.
Because part of what the Montgomery Improvement Association did was they were waiting on the right case.
Because they had 2 other cases. The women who didn't meet their standards of decency, they're perfectly fine people, they wouldn't meet their standards, and so they were praying, where's Rosa Parks? You know?
So it was the right case.
Yeah.
But here, if we recognize that this is a profit-driven prison industrial complex, that this is a politicized issue we're dealing with, and not just crime, we have to be willing to take some unpopular stands. I mean, some of my colleagues looked at me strange when I stood up for Janarlo Wilson, because here he was, yes, in a hotel room. Young people were there having a sex party. They were there imitating what they saw on a rap video. And the situation, what they were in, was reprehensible. And here the clergy standing up for this. And Troy Davis is, you know, he's no saint. But what does it mean to stand up for young people? Some of them might have a rap sheet.
Well, then if I could just jump in, I think in terms of young people and is the mic on? Okay, there we go. When I think about, you know, young people in our community, I guess the question that comes to my mind is, what are we preparing young people for? You know, what are our schools preparing young people for? Are we preparing them? So, Mayor Franklin, when you raised the issue of the high school students who are graduating, and that a number of them have really been displaced and disenfranchised throughout their educational experiences, what have they been prepared for? Are they groomed for leadership, for world leadership? Or are they being prepared and groomed to be prisoners, a part of the prison industrial complex? You know, that's the question that I have, and I think about the advantages that Reverend Warnock and I have had because of people like Professor Bond and Professor Franklin. The trailblazers have made the way so that you do have a new black middle class. People like us who've been able to go to elite schools and to have an opportunity to go on and have higher educational experiences. But when you look at the larger African American community, and even though you see increased rates of bachelor's degrees being awarded more and more, in fact, more women are applying to master's degree programs and PhD programs, but we don't see women, African American women and women of color reflected in the professoriate. We don't see them in tenure track positions. So when you think about political leadership and educational leadership, you have a lot of women working behind the scenes, but you don't have women in positions of leadership. And even with young people, we've seen greater opportunities for us to assume positions socially and politically. But I wonder in terms of wealth, you know, in terms of, and I was reading a report somewhere, I was trying to find the numbers. Even though we have this new black middle class and we've been able to make advances educationally, socially, and politically, in terms of the net worth, you know, what black families have, we are disproportionately in poverty compared to white families. And so you then have this generational issue of lack of generational, you don't have generational wealth, you don't have the same access to education, so there's a great deal of disenfranchisement that's still perpetuated and continued. I think educational access and educational equity are huge civil rights issues. I hope we will talk about that later as well. What are the curricular changes and what has been done to prepare our young people to be able to speak Chinese to their peers? You know, we have a great deal of products that come from China. Are our children going to be able to communicate with them? Are they going to be able, you have a large Latino population. Do our children speak Spanish? Do they have the toolkit that they need to succeed? Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that we're really preparing them that way. That's not to say that none of them are, but I don't know that it's deliberate, and if that's a priority for us.
Mm-hmm. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, wishes to argue that just similar to slavery and Jim Crow segregation, the system of mass incarceration and its connection to public education has now forced a new system of social control of those now labeled as prisoners, as criminals. What do you see as, this is Dr. Alexander's perspective. What do you see as the new Jim Crow of our time? Where do we begin to forge new sort of communities?
Frankly, I felt a little uneasy when I read that description of the new Jim Crow, because every year since I've been alive, somebody has said XYZ is the new civil rights. Think back on it. It usually happens in January or February of each year. And all these things cannot be the new civil rights. I mean, there are many, many concerns all of us have, and this mass incorporation is one, and it's surely among the most important, but every year somebody says XYZ is the new civil rights. Come on. Anyway, I was thinking when Mayor Franklin was talking about schools and children having no home to live in, as we understand a home to be. I live in Washington, D.C., and many of the schools in D.C., or I was just in New York over the weekend, many of the schools in New York have policemen in them. And they have policemen in them because they feel the need for that. For some reason, they need an armed guard standing. But what that means is that when something happens at the school, the policeman who has the arrest power says to the little girl, the little boy, I'm taking you down. And down they go into the system, and that's like an admissions, they're paying an admissions fee to something that will last a long, long time and stick with them for the rest of their lives. And there's no need for this to happen. We don't need this to happen. I don't know why New York does it. I don't know why some schools in D.C. do it, but there's nobody in D.C., as far as I know, who needs an armed guard over them when they're that age and they're not misbehaving to the extent that one thinks you require policemen in. So I think our reaction as a larger society to young people helps create these problems. We create opportunities for them to be arrested, to get a criminal record. When I think you said, Mayor, somebody mentioned on this panel, discretion. The discretion to do it, Reverend Warnock, discretion to arrest, discretion not to arrest. And when you exercise that discretion, you put a brand on that child for a long, long time. And if only we could exercise a little other kind of discretion and not do those things, we'd be better off. I mean, there are many, many things we need to be doing, but that's just one thing. We just exercise a little discretion.
There were two ways to approach when I was running for office, I was asked about three things every time. What are you going to do about the water system? What are you going to do about traffic? And what are you going to do about public education? And of those three, the only one that the mayor is responsible for was water. So if you're from Atlanta, you'll know that I'm the sewer mayor. I fixed the sewer so that hotels, so that we could continue to build. But halfway through my 8 years, I decided that I would circle back on education. So I went into the schools and I started talking to young people about how we might fashion a post-secondary possibility for them. And the criticism that I got was that I was dealing with the young people who were making it because they were still in school, and that I was not doing enough about the young people who were not making it and who were having problems. And, I listened to that, but I believed that if I could begin to show more examples, not just of four-year degrees, but of young people who really did have tough lives, that they could get through this and get to the next step, that perhaps that would be the balance to all of the good programs on the other side to keep kids, focused. And there's some really great stories. I mean, some of the work we were able to do is with courts. A young man just graduated from Lincoln University in Missouri. He was in court for armed robbery. We persuaded the judge to give him a chance. He graduated with 3.2 from Lincoln University, a BS, and is now studying for his MCATs. He got out. Now, the point is, we say that if this young man, Demetrius, if he can make it, he was in the court system. We found a school that was the right place for him to be. There is a school other than Morehouse, gentlemen. And a wonderful place. But the fact of the matter is, in 4 years, he was able, in a nurturing environment, to turn his life around. I think we need national policy to do that. I think summer jobs programs are fine as far as they go. We need national policy that says to young people, if you want to do something with your life, regardless of what the past was, that was the entry requirement for this program. All you had to do was show up. Your GPA, your SAT, your aptitude, none of that mattered. Just show up and have a real conversation. I think America needs to do that with 100% of the young people, both those who are not perfect and those whose parents think they are perfect. I think we need a national policy. And I think we can make this correction in less than a decade. I mean, every young person between some age, just pick an age, we need to say, come downtown, this is the place. It's our opportunity to help you on your way. It's cheaper than Afghanistan. It's cheaper than Iraq. I mean, it's definitely cheaper than those two. And I think we still are operating under a cultural model that those who are worthy are worth the attention. And I believe this particular conference, one of the reasons I was interested in coming, is I think the moral leadership has to come from the faith community, both the clergy and the lay leadership, to say that there are no mistakes. God did not make any mistakes. All these people are worthy of our attention and our help. And just close on this. I would say often, and Reverend Warnock might remember, went under attack, which was pretty frequently. As mayor, I would remind the reporters. I said, did I tell you all I was perfect? And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, because I'm not. And there isn't anybody doing any of these jobs that's perfect. What we're doing is the best we can under the circumstances, and we expect to be held accountable. But trust me, in some conversations, that was a revolutionary notion.
Mayor Franklin, if I may ask, one of the conversations taking place in theological circles like this has to do with the declining significance of faith, of the church in the public square. As a mayor, from political perspective, are politicians still listening to
absolutely.
the church?
Absolutely. I worked for Andy Young, and I always had a little bit of jealousy because as a member of the clergy, about once a quarter for 8 years, he would meet with the clergy, and there would be no staff there, so I never knew what was discussed. So one of the things that I did and other mayors have done is have regular meetings with the clergy. And I met 9 months out of the year, once a month. Meeting was open, we could talk about anything. That was the group that told me I had to take on the issue of homelessness, even though it was not the charter responsibility of the city of Atlanta. It belonged to Fulton County, another government, but that was the group that held me accountable and said you have to do more than just walk past a homeless person and put a coin or a dollar bill in a cup. I found the faith community, the faith leadership, whether they came or didn't come and sent their representatives, to be a key partner in much of the work that we were able to accomplish in 8 years. And I think most mayors who are concerned about the issues of poverty, who are concerned about the issues of class, and they're concerned about the issues of the new Jim Crow, whatever that might be, do turn to the faith community. And I would not have taken on homelessness had the faith community not stood side by side with me, helping along the way on that.
As we begin to open up the floor for questions and dialogue, Dr. Warnock, how do you feel about the connection between the church sort of recovering that kind of prophetic dimension of the witness of the church as we saw during the Civil Rights Movement within today's context?
I'm very concerned about where the church is right now, the church in general, the black church in particular. Black churches have always, as I said to a group that met at our church Friday night, the Black Religious Scholars group was at Ebenezer. Black church has always been a mixed bag of kind of a liberationist vision and commitment on the one hand, and then it's also been a very custodian of some of the most conservative views that get promulgated in our discussion about who we are and where we ought to go. But there is this continuity. I think Gaylord Wilmore and others have identified it correctly. There is this thread of radicalism that runs throughout the whole history of the black church, and for some good historic reasons. There is a liberationist bent there. But Dr. King and those who worked alongside him, Dr. Bond and others, did an incredible thing for us when this movement, which was church-led, literally went after the soul of a nation. That was the mantra of SCLC, to redeem the soul of America. And that's very significant because there's this kind of evangelical consciousness in America. You know, got to make sure people's souls are saved. And they said, we want to redeem the soul of a nation. And that captured the imagination of many. There were many who fought alongside Dr. King. And now, 40 years later, everybody celebrates Dr. King. Even those who are fighting against everything he represented, they do it in the name of Dr. King. But what concerns me with respect to the black church is I'm not convinced that the black church has actually embraced Dr. King. We celebrate Dr. King, and we lift up his name, and we lift up the civil rights movement as an extraordinary historic moment. And wasn't it wonderful what happened in that moment with black churches involved? Dr. King, on the other hand, through his theology, through his deep thinking and reflection, his engagement of the world and of Scripture, he came to see freedom fighting as essential to what it means to be a Christian. It wasn't an extracurricular activity. It wasn't a moment. It wasn't a hiccup. It was central to his very doctrine of the church. And I don't believe even the churches that are engaged in activist activities from time to time, liberationist activities, I think you can be involved politically from time to time and not see liberation as central to your mission. I think if we saw it as central to our mission, we'd align our budgets a little differently.
Absolutely.
We'd do some things a little different.
Well, and as we know, only a small percentage of churches were actually directly engaged in the civil rights.
Well, his own denomination split and put him out of the National Baptist Convention. And years later, when the president who kicked him out, J.H. Jackson, found that the street in Chicago had been named Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, he changed the entrance of his church so that he wouldn't have that name on the stationery. So there was always a radical remnant. It was never the whole church. I always laugh at, as someone born in, a year after Dr. King's death, I You know, no disrespect, but sometimes I say to myself, every black person I know over 55 marched with Dr. King. And there are not enough streets in America for all the people who marched with Dr. King. So it was a radical remnant then. Whatever it is we need to do, and by the way, I do think the prison industrial complex is the new Jim Crow. But those who are willing to take that on, it'll be a radical remnant now, and it will cost us. It will cost, because you're talking about going after the beast. And that beast won't die without a real fight.
That's true. Could we have perhaps some closing remarks as we open up the floor for questions and comments, beginning with Dr. Karen Jackson Weaver?
I just want to say something briefly related to some of the themes that we've heard today. Dr. King gave a speech, "Where do we go from here?" And one of the things he said is that of the good things in life, the Negro has approximately 1/2 those of whites. Of the bad things of life, he has twice those of whites. Thus, half of all Negroes live in substandard housing, and Negroes have half the income of whites. In other spheres, the figures are equally alarming. In elementary schools, Negroes lag 1 to 3 years behind whites, and their segregated schools receive substantially less money per student than the white schools. 1/20 as many Negroes as whites attend college. Of employed Negroes, 75% hold menial jobs. And I wonder, as I think about the speech that he made, I believe this was in 1957, actually at Ebenezer, historic Ebenezer, how much has changed today in terms of the state of the black community. And I think Mayor Franklin suggested a radical suggestion about creating policy as well as initiatives that will transform our communities with a focus on young people. I believe there also has to be a focus on educational equity and access, as well as educational excellence, in preparing young people for leadership socially, politically, and making sure that they're groomed to engage in business and global leadership. But I also think that the church, quite broadly defined, those in leadership, educators, theologians, and scholars, we have a responsibility as well in our classrooms to create spaces to teach and make sure they understand and embrace their heritage and their history, and understand their obligation, their duty and their responsibility. And I tell this to my kids, and it's so interesting because my mom grew up in Nottoway County, which is right beside Prince Edward County. And as many of you know, after the Brown decision, Prince Edward County schools closed for 5 years. So rather than integrate the Prince Edward County schools, they closed for 5 years. And so you know. So my mother was in Nottoway County, and she would tell us about how the kids would come to Nottoway County and go to other places to be educated. And I didn't realize it then, but I've come to appreciate now. She was a catalyst in my life and making me want to study history and to make sure that there were things that I did in my life that had a powerful impact in my day-to-day activities, not just for me and my family, but for the community at large. And she would tell us, you know, you all celebrate Black History Month. It used to be Negro History Week. And she would tell us about Carter G. Woodson. And I wonder how much is being done so that American education and American history is really integrating African American history and achievements and contributions that African Americans have made. I don't think a lot has been done in that regard. So I think as we think about where do we go from here in the state of the Black community, I think there are very deliberate things that we can do to create access, to be inclusive and proactive, and to really acknowledge the vestiges of white supremacy that still exists.
Well said. Dr. Warnock.
Thank you. On the one hand, we have to continue to fight systemic injustice, systems that exploit the poor. On the other hand, we have to be willing to lovingly correct the self-defeating, self-destructive practices of the poor. I've said some things today about the prison industrial complex. We've got to fight that. That's the prophetic side. But as the priestly side of what I do as a pastor, I show up in courtrooms, and I'm there sometimes with young people. And if you want to see what's happening, go to a courtroom one day, and you will literally watch mostly black men and some brown men, one after the other. Just pick a courtroom.
Black women too.
Day, and black women.
Yes.
Absolutely. All day, every single day. So we have to confront the systemic injustice that's behind that. But at the same time, there is this kind of valorization of thug life and gangster culture that we have to be honest about, and that's because that's part of the vicious cycle. I mean, that gets promulgated through great corporate interests as well. So we have to confront the poor. And we have to confront, some of our children are not even poor. They're middle class kids. Every now and then I've been up on Martha's Vineyard, and I've seen middle class kids walking around trying to be hard, and you could tell they didn't know what they were doing. Stuff didn't even come out right. And but there's this valorization of what it means to, of poverty, of thug life, gangster culture, of not being smart. And it's not just limited to black kids. I mean, that's a problem in the United States of America. If you ask me, that's in part of how George Bush was elected, in part because of the, kind of Forrest Gump complex in the United States of America. There's something great about showing how much you don't know. But when America has the flu, black America has double pneumonia. So we've got to fight on both of these fronts. I think this prison industrial complex piece is connected to the criminal state of public education in America. And these issues are complex. We remain committed. Finally, let me say that the discussion is around the black freedom struggle, and I'm absolutely committed to that. But part of what we have to find ways of saying in the public square is that what happens to black America is inextricably connected to what happens to America. Dr. King said we're tied in a single garment of destiny, caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. It was true then. If there's any such thing, I think it's even truer now. If you've got 50% of your young people dropping out of high school, or 70% of young black men and Latino men and women dropping out of high school, and the nation, at the same time that the nation is becoming browner and blacker, the country is in trouble. And meanwhile, other nations are investing deeply in education. So somehow, I mean, that was part, I think, of the genius of the civil rights movement of Dr. King, is he showed the ways in which he was liberating not just black people, but liberating the South. And indeed, that's exactly what the civil rights movement did. We wouldn't have the Georgia Dome. We wouldn't have all this prosperity in Atlanta. We wouldn't have these teams if the South was still cordoned off in this kind of segregationist past. It would, the South would look different. You wouldn't have the prosperity that you have. And I think the same thing for the nation. Somehow we've got to find a way to frame the discussion so that the nation understands that its fate is inescapably tied to the fate of young people.
Just a couple of comments. One of them, just to add to that, we have to have the discussion, we have to have the policies, and then we have to be brave enough and bold enough to claim the resources. We cannot act as if it's going to cost no money, no time, no heartache, no struggle. And as a former elected official, it was typical for folks to say, well, we want you to do it, but we don't want it to cost. I was in my 50s when I was mayor. I was too old I was already old enough to know that things cost. They cost money, and we got to find some coalitions around how we spend our resources. Some of it's money, obviously natural resources and the built environment. I had one of my mentors, Maynard Jackson, say to me when I was running for office in 2001, he said, Shirley, if you say you're going to raise taxes, you won't get elected. And I said, if I say that I'm not going to raise taxes and I don't know what the city's financial state is and I'm elected mayor, I'm going to be very upset. So I didn't say it, and I barely won. But the fact of the matter is, lots of the things that we want to do have to either be a reallocation of funds or new funding. And we cannot act as if just a pat on the back or a meeting with the mayor is going to be enough for a young person to turn their life around. When they don't have a place to live, they may need psychological assistance, medical care. Money to go to school is going to cost money. And I hope that as we put together our plans, we don't leave that out. Because otherwise, for me, it's just a hope. And a hope is a wonderful thing to have as an inspiration, but often to realize that hope, you've got to have money. Your niece is out of jail because you bonded her out, not because you wished it out. She had to be bonded out. That costs money. So, right person in the wrong place, under a circumstance that didn't help, that put her in that situation, cost money.
Two things very quickly. I just want to second what other members of the panel have said. I agree with everything they said. But let me say something about Reverend Warnock. I don't go to church. I don't belong to a church. I've never belonged to a church. I've never gone to church. I heard him preach at Ebenezer Baptist Church almost by chance. I was leading a civil rights tour, and we wanted to go to Ebenezer because it's the church to go to. It was AIDS Sunday, and he preached about AIDS. And I thought, wow, I bet you there's not another black church within 50 miles of here where they're talking about that. Not another one where the radical remnant that he's talked about exists. And so we were so happy to hear that and so pleased to know him. You've been treated to a great treat here, to sit in the room with a man who stands in the pulpit where Martin Luther King once stood and who preaches with all the elegance and eloquence that Dr. King had. There's something else I wanted to say, which I seem to have forgotten, so I won't say it. But I agree with everything you've heard here.
Right. Right. Can we give our panel a round of applause? Thank you so much. We do have some presentations, but before we go into the presentations, we'd like to open up the floor for just a few questions of the panel. There are microphones located. I think there's one right here in the middle. So please, by all means, let us now hear from the floor, your questions.
Thank you. I'm an Army veteran. My son is an Army veteran, having served in Iraq. I'm an out queer scholar. I work on the campus of Northwestern University, and I'm also a proud recipient of the Hope Scholarship. I call Atlanta home. So I thank you, panel. I find myself sincerely reminded of W.E.B. Du Bois's his first chapter where he writes this question: how does it feel to be a problem? And I'm asking for your sage reflections on the idea of the interconnectedness of oppression, specifically as it relates to the continued works of civil rights and the black, lesbian, bisexual, gay, and queer community.
That's what I forgot I wanted to speak about. The black church, I just saw a survey, I didn't just see it, but about 2 years ago I saw a survey of religious groups and their feelings toward homosexuals and lesbians. And almost every religious group in the country, Baptists, Methodists, down the line, had increased their tolerance of homosexuality, except one group. And what was that group? Black people. Black people's tolerance had decreased. Were less tolerant of homosexuals. And you see this almost pathological interest in the black church in homosexuality. There's got to be something weird going on there, don't you think? This weird fixation on homosexuality. You know, there's a mega church here that has been involved in some kind of scandal. And you got to, well, and then you see this succession of white religious figures who've been revealed to have been themselves gay, who made their careers preaching about the evilness of homosexuality, and then whoop, oh my Lord, how'd that happen? You know how it happened, come on. So, I mean, there's no dividing civil rights so everybody in the country has civil rights, and there's no such thing, you know, as black civil rights or white civil rights or gay civil rights. Everybody has civil rights. I don't care who you are or what you do, you have civil rights. You have them, I have them, we all have them, and we have to protect each other's. I must protect yours and you must protect mine, because we both suffer if either of us falls down on the job.
Thank you.
Since the church came up, can I respond?
Sure.
I think that part of what the black church has to do as we engage this issue is that it's got to probe its own historic liberationist hermeneutic for a key to how to respond to this. Very often what you hear is the Bible says, and enough religion scholars here to know that very often when somebody gets ready to oppress you, they say the Bible says. And we understand the complexity involved in that, and that faith traditions need healthy doses of deep critical reflection, philosophical reflections, experience, all of that. And these canons are products of the community. The community is a slave to the canon, products of the community. And black folk managed to have a liberationist hermeneutic while engaged in the same Bible that the slave masters had. Clarice Martin and others pointed this out very brilliantly, that, for example, the household codes. Black folk never read Slaves Obey Your Masters. We just skipped over it. I mean, we never read it, or we read it. I've never heard anybody read that in a black church, and I've been in a black church my whole life, and say, "Thus is the word of the Lord," and sit down. We don't ever do that. And that's because we're looking at the text through a lens of experience. Now, the same preachers who won't say that with respect to slavery, as Clarice Martin and others have pointed out, they don't bring the same freedom hermeneutic to wives obey your husbands, and it's in the same text. Yep. So somehow, who you know and who you're actually physically connected to, having experience, informs how you go about this. So somehow we've got to probe our own past, how we've engaged these texts, as a key to how we deal with this issue of sexual orientation. And part of the challenge that we're up against is that for the first time, you have large numbers of black fundamentalist Christians. We came to fundamentalism late. We didn't have a kind of worked out scientific kind of perspective that lists these sort of, that we came to that late. So now if you've got Bible believing Christians, then any kind of other issues of identity, black, the Exodus motif, all of these things that have helped to inform how we engage the text, all of that is put aside for the assumption of some transcendent view of Scripture, which we all know is politically biased. But we got to have some real deep conversations about that.
Well said. To those posing questions, if you could just pose your question directly, we'll hear from all of the persons asking questions, and then we'll have a response, final response by the panel.
My name is Sam Shirley from Emory University. I must say I love Mayor Franklin. She was a great mayor of the city of Atlanta. Absolutely. She sent in the great tradition of Andrew Young, Ambassador Young. She represented this city, the city of the dream and the dreamer, and the dream lies between this hotel and Morehouse.
Yes, sir.
And Europeans just created the MLK Center in Europe, and if you see how the dream in Europe is living, and that migrants are now fighting for that. What I want to say, my question is, how to stop mass incarceration, redefine crime, and build a welfare state? If it doesn't start in Atlanta, it will start nowhere. Thank you.
Well said. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. My question has to do with what, assuming we can figure out, is the galvanizing issue or issues for the next leg of the journey, what is the institutional locus of social action and change? The institutions that were birthed in the civil rights movement are now the traditional civil rights institutions, and to post-1964 babies, we don't see our place in those institutions. Where should we be galvanizing, mobilizing, and preparing to serve?
Resources. Good question.
First, thank you for coming. I'm really glad to be here. As a seminarian, I have this question about where we're going in the future. And one of my particular interests happens to be in the electronic age and how that may help or hinder us in our move towards freedom. You talked about your niece and how her driver's license was magically suspended. We had this issue with voting, electronic voting, in previous elections, and I wondered what your perspective is on the increasing electronicization of our society and how that may help or hinder us in the future, because things seem to be happening again and again and more increasingly around this issue.
Thank you.
Hello, my question is directed primarily at Dr. Warnock, and I'm speaking just by way of background as a former prosecutor and a current seminarian who sees her goal, actually her call, as working on prison reform and prison reentry issues. So Dr. Warnock and any other panelists who have a say on it, how do you see the role of the Black church in particular on policy issues in addition to individual issues that you mentioned, such as valorization of criminal life?
Thank you.
Yes, and my question has to do with Alexander's critique, mild critique of King, is that he moved from a more conservative to a radical, from civil rights to human rights. So do we need to reframe the question to become more human rights in our contemporary context? And I think the Reverend, you spoke implicitly about it, but not necessarily using the term human rights as opposed to civil rights.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have observations and questions related to the prison industrial complex, those institutions that mediate change, what resources do we point to, the connection between policy, public policy and the church, and also how do we begin to sort of carve out language, human rights, civil rights, that helps us to move forward in the future. Final remarks.
Very quickly, the church has to find its voice around these issues. Dr. King saw freedom fighting as the church's reason for being. And we won't address public policy if we don't see it as our reason for being. We'll just be saving individuals. So we got to reframe our theological vision of who we are and what we're called to do. There was the second one about human rights and civil rights. One of the things that I've done recently is I've gotten deeply involved with the Troy Davis case, is I work very closely with Amnesty International. And I plan to become increasingly involved with them. Because very often these human rights groups sometimes take on issues that where if we collaborate with them, we raise the issue. I think if black folk are just talking about, as important as race is, and I think that's the master narrative in America, but if we're just focused on race, and if it's just focused in North America, we lose our moral credibility. Part of the power of Dr. King was his vast global vision. And the church and our civil rights organizations, those that have been around, the new ones that need to emerge, have got to get their arms around a third world vision, that we've got to fight for the poor people all around the world.
Just from a political standpoint, I think that the coalitions, building coalitions. I was reputed to be the last black mayor of Atlanta, when in fact, another black person was elected. But the theory was that if the population were not predominantly black, a black person couldn't run. Now, hopefully that's parked forever in yesterday's history with Barack Obama and President Obama. But this whole notion that we can't lead unless we're just leading ourselves. So how do you form coalitions? What are those coalitions around? The work we're doing with the Center for Civil Rights started out to commemorate, celebrate, study, understand the civil rights movement and the role that Atlantans might have played. Quickly moved to human rights in recognition that it's a much broader and bigger discussion that needs to take place, and that there are few places in America, few institutions in America where that conversation is ongoing and available to the public. It's available in the academy, and it's available in associations, but not necessarily available in the public. As for these new institutions, I recently spent some time presenting a program of 3 women who changed federal law by their own acts, their own actions. And one was employment law, one was business, opportunities for business in affirmative action at both the local and the federal level, and the other was around the issue of choice, health issues. And in each of those cases, there were 3 women between 1969 and 1974 who had just had enough. And their cases ended up being decided at the federal level and now are the law of the land. The purpose of that discussion was to say change comes because of institutions, organizations and groups and individuals. So there is a place to enter the fray and the discussion if in fact we want to make change.
I just wanted to speak to two of the questions I heard. I think the young woman was asking whether or not today's institutions are relevant to today's people. Until this year, I was chairman of the board of the NAACP. We celebrated our 100th birthday in 2009. So we're 100 years old. We're older than all these other civil rights groups. And we've always been here, and I think we'll be here for another 100 years. I hope we won't be needed another 100 years. And we'll be here for another 100 years because we're built on people. We have a membership made up of people who join us. And while sometimes we've had troubles at the top, our leadership hadn't acted the way they should have behaved the way they could have, or didn't do the right kind of thing, the people kept the organization going. And it's going to keep going, I think, for a long time. And there's a place for everybody in this room in the NAACP. In the National Association for the Advancement of colored people come in all colors. Anybody who shares our values is more than welcome. NAACP.org. We'll sign you up this afternoon. Go up in your room, get on your laptop, get it. We'd love to have you. And the other question about what issue, Reverend Warnock talked about an abolitionist movement. You know, Angela Davis, whose name is familiar to all of you, has begun an abolitionist movement, an abolish the prisons movement. I don't know a great deal about it, and I don't know if it's something I would be interested in if I knew more about it or not. But it seems to me, knowing her, something worth examining. So I bet you can Google her and find out something about it, her abolitionist movement for prison. And the issue, of course, is the school to prison pipeline. That's the issue. All of us know about it. We're familiar with this phrase. And we know that there are other people around the country who are engaged in talking at one part of this. And surely there are ways within that sort of nebulous movement now that can fit all of us, can take us all in, and we can find spots where we can join in this movement, because this is surely a major issue, if not the issue, a major issue facing America today.
Once again, can we give our panel a big round of applause? Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm going to ask the panelists to please stand. Dr. Karen Jackson-Weaver has some presentations we'd like to share with the panel. But thank you so much for your patience. We know that time is upon us. There's a reception right next door, if you have the time, right next to my left in the conference room B that we've organized to meet the panel.
I just want to ask you if you could bear with us for maybe another minute or two. I sincerely want to thank our distinguished panel, and I want to thank Dr. Johnny Hill for working with me to put together this panel. And it was his idea to have me participate. I was happy to sit and listen to our distinguished panels. Weren't they awesome this afternoon? I just want to say quickly, in my official role at Princeton, I'm the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Diversity, and one of the questions was raised about the locus. You know, where do we actually engage? And I think we have to be very deliberate about all of the areas that we engage in terms of human rights. That was the question too, about, you know, civil rights, human rights. Clearly our panelists here today have demonstrated a huge commitment to human rights. And in terms of the locus, I'm fortunate to work in my role not only at Princeton, but to make a difference in terms of making sure people are aware of the opportunities that exist at Princeton and our peer institutions in terms of graduate education. I have to put this little promotional plug in. Any of you who know of students who want to do undergraduate or graduate work and they're currently undergrads, if they're interested in summer programs, or any talented students who want to consider opportunities at our graduate school, we have literature at the back table if you want to pick that up. We do this because we acknowledge the disparity that we see, particularly with African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, as well as women in the sciences and the STEM fields. So we hope that you'll join us in addressing this disparity. But we also wanted to take this opportunity to acknowledge the leadership and the commitment to human rights that each of our panelists have demonstrated today. So I have some tokens that I would like to present to them at this time. And I will read one of them, and this will serve as the reading for each of them. It's from Princeton University, and it's the Exemplary Public Service Award presented to, the first one goes to the Honorable Julian Vaughn for your exceptional devotion to human rights. Secondly, we have the award presented to, the same award presented to the Honorable Shirley Franklin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
And our final award goes to Reverend Warnock and the Ebenezer Baptist Church. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So will you please join me, John, as well, in thanking our wonderful panel today for their wonderful presentations and for their commitment to human rights and justice all over the world.